He was the quietest man in the county until the day he saw her, shackled, alone, and accused of a crime she didn't commit. Before I tell you how one silent rancher risked everything for her, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the real stories history tried to bury. The first light of dawn crept over the ridgeline, spilling gold across the rolling pasture. Out beyond the weathered fence posts, cattle moved slow and heavy, their breath turning to mist in the chill morning air. The ranch sat in quiet isolation, a small wooden house hunched low against the wind, its paint long faded to the color of old parchment. The front porch sagged slightly, and the boards creaked under the weight of years. But to the man who lived here, it was home, the only place where the noise of the world could not find him. His name was Samuel Hart, though most folks in Dry Creek simply called him the Quiet One. For as long as anyone could remember, Samuel kept to himself. He wasn't unfriendly, but his words were few, and his temper slower still. Men in town respected him for it, even if they didn't understand him. Quiet but fair, they'd say at the saloon, the phrase always spoken with a mix of admiration and mild curiosity. He had no wife, no children, and no interest in gossip or politics. In a county where everyone knew everyone's business, Samuel remained a man apart. That morning was like any other. Samuel rose before the sun, pulling on his worn boots by the dim light of an oil lamp. Outside, the air was sharp, scented with sage and dust. He checked the corral first, counting the cattle with an experienced eye. A few strays lingered near the fence line, and he whistled low to bring them in. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. Years of working the land had taught him there was no use rushing against the rhythm of the day. Inside the house, a coffee pot simmered on the stove. The black liquid was bitter and strong, just the way Samuel liked it. He sat at the small wooden table, sipping slowly, the steam fogging his vision for a moment. Across from him, the other chair sat empty, as it always did. Once, long ago, that chair had been meant for someone, but that was another life, one he never spoke of. The ranch was quiet, except for the occasional call of a hawk overhead. A breeze pushed through the dry grass, making it hiss like a whispered secret. Samuel liked that sound. He liked the way the open land could speak without words. Out here, a man didn't need to pretend. He could be exactly who he was, and the earth would neither praise nor condemn him. Every few weeks, Samuel made the ride into Dry Creek to pick up supplies: flour, coffee beans, nails for mending the barn. He kept those trips short. The town was too loud, too full of chatter that didn't matter. Folks there argued about elections, land disputes, and whose cattle had wandered where. Samuel had no patience for it. In his mind, a man's worth was in the work he did, not in the noise he made. Yet even with all the solitude he preferred, there were moments when the quiet felt heavy, pressing down like a weight on his chest. He'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink into the horizon, and feel a strange pull, as if something was missing. But he'd learned long ago not to dwell on that feeling. The land kept him busy, and work had a way of silencing questions better left unanswered. The people of Dry Creek had grown used to his ways. The shopkeeper never tried to make small talk when Samuel came in. The blacksmith gave him a nod instead of a greeting. And the saloon girls didn't bother flashing him smiles. They knew he wouldn't look twice. That wasn't to say he was cold. If a neighbor needed help mending a fence after a storm, Samuel would show up, hammer in hand. If a stray calf wandered too far, he'd return it without asking for thanks. But he always disappeared just as quickly as he'd come, leaving behind only a quiet, "Take care." There was a calmness to his life, a steady rhythm like the ticking of a clock. Sunrise, work, supper, sleep. No surprises, no confrontations. In a world that was growing more unpredictable by the year,
Samuel had carved out a small piece of certainty and guarded it fiercely. He didn't go looking for trouble, and trouble, so far, hadn't come looking for him. Still, somewhere deep in the corners of his mind, he knew peace was a fragile thing. All it would take was one wrong turn, one moment of hesitation, for the balance to break. But he didn't know that day was coming soon. He didn't know that before the week was out, he'd be riding into town for what he thought was a simple supply run, and end up making a choice that would change not just his life, but the life of someone he had never met. For now, though, Samuel stood on his porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands. The sun was climbing higher, painting the fields in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance,
the faint echo of a church bell reached him. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of dust, grass, and coffee. Out here, the world was still simple. Out here, a man could believe it might stay that way. He set his cup down, pulled on his hat, and stepped into the day, unaware that the path ahead was already shifting beneath his feet. The morning sun was still low when Samuel saddled his horse, Buck, for the ride into Dry Creek. He made these trips once every few weeks, always at first light, always with a list folded neatly into the pocket of his coat. The ride was long and quiet, the kind of stretch where the road was more dust than dirt, lined with sagebrush and stubborn tufts of grass clinging to the dry earth. In the distance, the town sat like a small mirage against the horizon, its rooftops catching the sunlight in pale flashes. Samuel didn't look forward to going into town, but he didn't dread it either. It was just a necessary chore, like mending a fence or patching a saddle. Buck's hooves struck a steady rhythm on the hard-packed road, and Samuel let his mind drift. He thought about the nails he needed for the barn roof, the coffee beans that were running low, the tin of tobacco he might allow himself as a small indulgence. Simple things, predictable things. As he reached the outskirts, the sound of the town began to reach him, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shrill laughter of children darting through the street, the bark of a dog chasing a cart. It was market day, he realized, which meant Dry Creek would be busier than usual. He sighed through his nose. More people meant more noise, more eyes, and more pointless chatter. The main street was already crowded when he rode in. Merchants had set up stalls along the road, their tables piled with bolts of fabric, jars of molasses, and tins of penny candy. A man was selling leather boots from the back of his wagon, shouting over the din about their fine quality. The air smelled of fried dough and horse manure, a mixture Samuel had come to accept as part of town life. He guided Buck slowly through the throng, tipping his hat to the blacksmith and nodding at Mrs. Harper, who ran the dry goods store. Most people returned his greetings with a polite acknowledgement, then turned their attention elsewhere. Samuel liked it that way. He could move through the crowd without being pulled into conversations. He was halfway to the general store when he noticed a knot of people gathered near the courthouse steps. Their voices were louder than the rest of the market, sharp with laughter, edged with something uglier. Samuel's brow furrowed, and though he had no intention of stopping, his eyes were drawn to the source of the commotion. And then he saw her. She sat on the bottom step of the courthouse, her wrists bound with iron shackles linked by a short chain. Her dress, once white, was torn and smeared with dirt, and her long black hair hung in loose tangles around her face. But it was her posture, straight-backed despite the restraints, and the way she held her chin that caught Samuel's attention. There was a quiet defiance in her eyes, even as the sun beat down on her and the townsfolk jeered. A group of men stood nearby, trading crude jokes at her expense. One spat on the ground in front of her. Another, a heavy-set man with a whiskey-red face, laughed loudly and said something Samuel couldn't quite hear, but the tone was enough to make his jaw tighten. Two young boys mimicked the sound of a barking dog, circling her as if she were some wild thing. Samuel's first instinct was to look away. It wasn't his business. Trouble like this had a way of pulling a man in deeper than he meant to go. He had seen it happen before. A neighbor once got himself shot trying to break up a fight that wasn't his to fight.
But even as he tried to focus on the dry goods store ahead, his eyes kept sliding back to the girl. Her gaze moved across the crowd, not pleading, not asking for help, just watching. When her eyes met Samuel's, something in his chest tightened. It wasn't recognition. He had never seen her before. But there was something in that look, a steady, unflinching calm in the face of humiliation, that held him rooted to the spot for longer than he meant to stand there. A man in a dusty brown coat leaned toward Samuel, following his line of sight. "Indian girl," he muttered. "Caught her trying to steal from the mercantile. Sheriff's holding her till the judge comes through next week." The man smirked. "Course, she'll probably end up scrubbing floors for someone instead of rotting in a cell, if she's lucky." Samuel didn't respond. He didn't need to hear more to know that the truth of her situation was probably far more complicated than what the man had just offered. He'd lived long enough to know that rumors in Dry Creek traveled faster than facts, and the ones involving
native folk were almost always twisted to fit the comfort of those telling them. He finally turned toward the store, forcing himself to keep walking, but the image of her sitting there, chains glinting in the sun, dust clinging to her bare feet, followed him. Even inside, as he spoke quietly with the shopkeeper about nails and coffee, he found his mind wandering back to the courthouse steps. The laughter he'd heard outside seemed to echo in his ears, mocking and mean. By the time he stepped back into the street, the crowd around her had thinned. A lone deputy leaned against the railing, arms crossed, his expression bored. The girl hadn't moved much. Her gaze was fixed somewhere far beyond the street, as if she were looking past the town entirely. Samuel untied Buck from the post, placing the supplies carefully into the saddlebag. He told himself to ride home, to forget about what he'd seen. But as he swung into the saddle, his hands hesitated on the reins. The deputy shifted lazily, not even noticing him. The girl's eyes flicked toward him again, just for a second, and that was enough to send a ripple through his resolve. He clicked his tongue, and Buck began to walk. He didn't look back this time, but the weight of that moment, of that look, stayed with him all the way down the road out of town. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of dust and fried dough, and Samuel found himself gripping the reins tighter than usual. For most men in Dry Creek, that chained girl would be just another piece of market-day gossip. For Samuel Hart, though he didn't yet understand why, she was something else entirely, the beginning of a question he couldn't stop himself from asking. The next morning, Samuel's chores felt heavier than usual. The cattle moved lazily in the pasture, the wind was still, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue. But his thoughts were not on the ranch. They kept circling back to the courthouse steps, to the girl in chains, and to the eyes that had met his without flinching. He tried to push the memory away. He split wood for the stove, mended a broken section of fence, and hauled a sack of grain to the barn. But no matter how hard he worked, the sound of that crowd's laughter and the sight of her bruised wrists stayed fixed in his mind like a thorn he couldn't pull out. By midday, he gave up trying to ignore it. He saddled Buck again, telling himself he was just going back to town for something he forgot, maybe nails, maybe lamp oil. The truth was, he wasn't sure what he was going for, only that he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know more. Dry Creek was quieter than it had been the day before. Market day was over, and the main street had settled back into its usual rhythm, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in slow intervals, the murmur of voices from the saloon, the creak of wagon wheels rolling past. The courthouse steps were empty now. The girl was gone. Samuel felt an unexpected pang at the sight, though he told himself it was just curiosity. Inside the mercantile, two women stood near the counter, their heads close together, voices low but sharp. "Did you hear? They caught that Indian girl trying to steal from the sheriff's wife," one said. "Took her silver hair comb right out of the bedroom." The other woman snorted. "That's not what I heard. My cousin says she's a runaway from a ranch up north, belonged to a cattleman who died last winter. They say she tried to take off with his horses." Samuel kept his back to them, pretending to study a shelf of nails.
"Oh, please," the first woman replied. "She's trouble no matter where she came from. Old Mrs. Collier swears she saw the girl whispering to herself in the street, says it sounded like a curse. Might be she's one of those medicine women or a witch." The second woman gasped quietly, her voice dropping to a hiss. "If she is, the sheriff's going to have to do more than keep her in the lockup." Samuel paid for his lamp oil and left without a word, but the snippets of gossip clung to him like dust. Each rumor was different, yet all carried the same note, the same readiness to believe the worst of her. None of it sat right with him. He had grown up around the county long enough to know how quickly lies could travel, especially about those who had no one to speak for them. Instead of heading home, he steered Buck toward the far end of town, where the buildings thinned and the road bent toward the rail yard. A narrow alley ran between the saloon and the feed store, and at the end of it sat a small, weather-beaten shack with a sign barely hanging by one hinge: Eli Turner, Horseshoeing and Repairs. More importantly, Eli had a way of knowing things. He wasn't one to gossip, but if there was truth to be found in a rumor, Eli usually had it.
Samuel found him hammering a shoe onto a restless chestnut mare. "Mornin', Eli," Samuel said. Eli grunted without looking up. "Mornin', Sam. You here for Buck or for something else?" "Something else," Samuel admitted. "Heard some talk in town about a girl the sheriff's holding." Eli's hammer paused mid-swing. He glanced up, his eyes sharp despite the wrinkles around them. "Ah, so you saw her." Samuel nodded once. "Yesterday. Courthouse steps." Eli finished the shoe before answering, setting his tools down with slow precision. "They're saying a lot of things, aren't they? Stealing, running off, witchcraft. Folks in this town love a good story, especially if it makes them feel bigger than the person they're talking about." "You know the truth?" Samuel asked. Eli leaned against the wall, wiping his hands on a rag. "I know enough. Her name's Mara. She came through here a few weeks back with her little brother. From what I heard, they were headed west, trying to find what was left of their people. Trouble is, her brother got sick. She went looking for help and ended up at the sheriff's door." Samuel's jaw tightened. And instead of helping, the sheriff decided she was worth more in chains than she was free. "There's a man over in Cedar Bluff looking for domestic help. Sheriff figures he can make the introduction and pocket a finder's fee." Eli's eyes hardened. "It's not the first time he's done it. Won't be the last." Samuel felt a slow heat building in his chest. "The boy?" Eli shook his head. "Don't know. Nobody's seen him since the day they took her in." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the rustle of hay in the stall and the soft snort of the chestnut mare. Eli finally broke the silence. "You thinking about getting involved, Sam? Because I'll tell you plain, it won't go over easy. The sheriff's got friends in every saloon and shop in this town. You step in, you'll make yourself an enemy in more than one place." Samuel looked out toward the street, watching a wagon rattle past. "I'm not looking for trouble." Eli gave a dry chuckle. "Trouble's already looking for you. I can see it in your face." Samuel didn't answer. He thanked Eli, mounted Buck, and started back toward the main road. The afternoon sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dirt. He told himself he'd just ride home, tend to his cattle, and forget all about Mara. But as the wind picked up and the town faded behind him, he knew he wouldn't. The rumors, the lies, the truth Eli had given him, they had all settled in his mind like stones in a stream, altering the current of his thoughts. Somewhere out there, locked away behind a sheriff's walls, was a girl whose fate was being decided by men who saw her as nothing more than property. And for reasons Samuel couldn't quite name, the thought of leaving her to that fate felt like a weight he could not carry. The ranch lay in a deep hush that night. The cattle were bedded down, the lanterns in the barn extinguished, and the only sound was the faint creak of the porch boards beneath Samuel's boots. The air was dry and cool,
carrying the faint smell of sage from the hills. Above, a scatter of stars shone like distant campfires, indifferent to the worries of men. Samuel sat in his old rocking chair, a glass of whiskey balanced in his hand. The amber liquid caught the light from the single lamp burning in the kitchen window, glowing like a coal. He took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in his chest, but it did nothing to quiet his mind. He had been here before, not in place, but in feeling. That restless tug in the gut, the sense that he was standing at a crossroads where one step would change everything. From the porch, the land rolled away into dark shapes, the fence lines disappearing into shadow. Out there was his world, quiet, ordered, and his alone. In town, there was chaos, talk, laughter at someone's expense, and a girl behind bars who didn't belong there. Samuel told himself again that it wasn't his problem. He'd worked too hard to carve out a life without entanglements. Men who poked their noses into other folks' business rarely got anything but grief for their trouble. And yet, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the glass dangling from his fingers. He could see her face again, not soft or pleading, but steady. She had looked at him like she was measuring the kind of man he was. And maybe, damn it, he was measuring himself, too. A breeze swept across the porch, rattling the dry leaves that had gathered in the corner. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, its cry thin and sharp against the silence. Samuel closed his eyes, and the sound pulled something from deep within him, a memory he had kept buried for years. It was another night, another porch. He had been younger then, his hair darker, his hands less calloused.
There had been a storm that evening, rain slashing sideways across the yard, the wind bending the pines until they groaned. And over the wind, faint at first, he had heard the cry for help. It had come from the riverbank, where the current ran fast and black in the rain. He'd hesitated, told himself it was probably nothing, that someone else closer would hear it. But the cries had come again, sharper this time, edged with panic. He'd grabbed his coat and run. By the time he reached the river, the water was swollen high against its banks. A boy, no older than 15, was clinging to a fallen branch caught in the current. His face was pale, his mouth gasping for air as the water dragged at him. Samuel had waded in, the cold biting into his legs. But the current was stronger than he expected, and every step forward felt like pushing through a wall. He was still 10 feet away when the branch broke free. The boy's eyes had met his for one brief, endless moment, and then the river had taken him. It had been over in seconds. Samuel sat now in the dark, feeling the weight of that moment as if it had just happened. The boy's name was Daniel. His family had moved away a month later. Samuel had never spoken of it to anyone, but he had carried it with him ever since, the knowledge that his hesitation had cost a life. The whiskey in his glass swirled gently as he set it on the railing. In town, Mara, that was her name, Eli had said, wasn't in a river. But she was just as surely being pulled under. Maybe not by water, but by something worse. The greed and cruelty of men who saw her as a thing to be traded. And if he stood by again? He pushed the thought away, stood and paced the length of the porch. His boots thudded softly on the boards. Helping her would mean stepping into the sheriff's path. It would mean questions, suspicion, maybe even a fight. The sheriff wasn't the type to let go of anything, or anyone, he thought he owned. And there were others in town who'd stand behind him for the right price. Samuel stopped at the far end of the porch, staring out toward the faint glow of Dry Creek, miles away but still visible against the horizon. He imagined the girl in a dark cell, the smell of damp wood and rusted metal around her. He imagined her looking up at the sound of boots in the hall, hoping maybe for a rescuer, and finding instead the sheriff with a deal in his pocket and a rope in his hand. The image made his jaw tighten until it ached. He told himself again it wasn't his business. He could finish his drink, turn in for the night, and let the world spin on without him. But deep down he knew the truth. If he did nothing, he would hear her chains in his sleep for the rest of his life, the way he still heard the river in his dreams. Samuel returned to his chair, picked up the glass, and drained the last of the whiskey. The liquid burned going down, but it felt cleaner somehow, like a line had been drawn inside him. He set the empty glass on the porch rail, took a deep breath, and exhaled slowly. The night air felt sharper now, filled with purpose. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do or how he'd do it. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to be too late this time. Somewhere out in the dark, the coyote called again. This time, Samuel didn't hear loneliness in its cry. He heard resolve. The morning came cold and clear, sunlight spilling across the dry hills in sheets of gold. Samuel's breath puffed in the air as he saddled Copper, his old chestnut gelding. The horse flicked an ear back at him as if asking if this was a supply run or something else entirely. Samuel didn't answer. He swung into the saddle, gave a click of his tongue and rode toward Dry Creek. The hooves thudded on packed earth, the rhythm steady, purposeful. The town was already alive when he reached it. Market day always drew a crowd, and today was no exception. Wagons lined the street, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread, horse sweat, and the tang of wood smoke from the blacksmith's forge. But Samuel's eyes were on the square. In front of the sheriff's office, a crude wooden post had been set up. And there she was, Mara, chained by the wrist to the post, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the ground. The chain caught the light in brief flashes. People milled around her, some gawking, others throwing quick glances before hurrying on. The sheriff leaned against the wall just outside his office, thumbs hooked in his belt. He was talking to a merchant, laughing at something only the two of them found funny. His broad hat shaded his eyes, but Samuel knew those eyes would be watchful, taking in every whisper, every coin exchanged. Samuel dismounted slowly, tying Copper to the rail in front of the saloon. He could feel the weight of eyes on him. Folks in town knew him well enough to know he didn't come here often unless it was for feed or supplies. He stepped into the square, boots loud on the boards, until he stood just a few feet from the sheriff and the girl. "Mornin', Sheriff," Samuel said, voice steady. The sheriff's gaze slid to him, slow and deliberate. "Well, look who's come down from his hill." "Morning, Samuel. Here for your oats." "Not today." Samuel's eyes flicked toward Mara. "What's this about?" The sheriff grinned without humor. "This? Just keeping the peace. She's been causing trouble. Needs to learn her place." A murmur went through the crowd, not everyone but enough to make Samuel feel the shift in the air. He kept his voice calm. "That's not what I heard." The sheriff's smile thinned. "You been listening to gossip?" "I've been listening to the truth." That was when the first real hush fell over the square. Folks at the bread stall stopped talking. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. The sheriff stepped forward, boots scuffing the dirt. "Careful, Samuel. Words like that might make people think you're on the wrong side of the law." Samuel didn't move. If the law chains up an innocent girl for show, maybe it's on the wrong side of people. A ripple of whispers broke out, darting through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Some faces showed surprise, others something closer to fear. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You accusing me of something?" "I'm saying she doesn't belong here," Samuel said, his voice carrying across the square. "If you've got proof she's done wrong, show it. If you don't, let her go." Mara lifted her head then, just slightly, enough for Samuel to see her eyes. They were tired but still steady, still measuring him like she had that first day. The sheriff laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "You've been up on your ranch too long, Samuel. Things work different here in town. Folks like her." "Folks like her," Samuel cut in, "are people. Same as you. Same as me." It was a simple sentence, but it landed like a stone in a still pond. The whispers grew louder, bolder. Somewhere in the back, someone muttered, "He's right." The sheriff's gaze swept over the crowd as if daring anyone else to speak. No one did. But the silence that followed wasn't on his side anymore. He turned back to Samuel. "You walk away right now and I'll forget you said anything. You stay here and you're picking a fight you won't win." Samuel took a slow step forward until he was close enough to see the fine dust on the sheriff's coat. His voice was low but clear. "I've already picked it." He turned back to Samuel. "You walk away right now and I'll forget you said anything. You stay here and you're picking a fight you won't win." Samuel took a slow step forward until he was close enough to see the fine dust on the sheriff's coat. His voice was low but clear. "I've already picked it." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The wind carried the faint sound of a shutter banging against a wall somewhere down the street. The sheriff's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw. He glanced at the crowd again, maybe realizing that the mood had shifted just enough to make a public scene dangerous, for him. With a sharp motion he turned, pulled a key from his belt and unlocked Mara's chain. The metal clinked as it fell away. "Fine," he said. "She's your problem now." A wave of gasps swept through the crowd. Mara rubbed her wrist, her expression unreadable. Samuel stepped back, giving her space, but his eyes stayed on the sheriff. The sheriff pointed a finger at him. "You just made yourself a target, Samuel. Don't forget that." Samuel didn't answer. He tipped his hat slightly to Mara, then turned toward Copper. The crowd parted for him, some giving nods, others still wide-eyed. The whispers followed him all the way to the rail. As he swung into the saddle, he caught sight of Mara standing free in the square. For the first time since he'd seen her, there was the faintest flicker of something in her face, not a smile exactly but close. Samuel reined Copper around, and together they rode out of Dry Creek, leaving the murmurs of the town behind. But he knew this wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. The moment Samuel and Mara left the last buildings of Dry Creek behind, the air felt different, less heavy but sharper somehow. The town's noise gave way to the hollow quiet of open country, where every sound carried far. The creak of leather saddles, the steady thump of hooves, and the faint jingle of bridle chains. Mara rode behind Samuel on Copper, her arms loosely around his waist. She didn't speak, and neither did he. There was too much to think about, too much that might be listening. The land stretched wide around them, golden in the late afternoon light. Dust rose behind Coppa's hooves in long curling trails that caught the sun before fading into the air. The hills rolled away in soft folds, dotted with low scrub and the occasional twisted mesquite. Every so often, Samuel glanced back toward Dry Creek. The horizon was empty, but he knew that didn't mean they were alone. The sheriff's warning had been too clear, too deliberate. "Hold on tight," Samuel said finally. "We'll make better time if we cut through Sand Hollow." Mara nodded once, her chin brushing his shoulder. The hollow was a dry riverbed, its sandy floor cutting between steep clay banks. Coppa's hooves sank slightly with each step, muffling the sound of their passage. Shadows stretched long as the sun dipped lower, the light turning orange and deep. When they finally stopped, night was creeping over the land. Samuel led Copper into a shallow gully where the wind was softer and set about making camp. He pulled his bedroll from the saddle and built a small fire from mesquite branches, keeping the flames low. Mara sat across from him, the firelight painting her face in gold and shadow. She held her hands out to the warmth, her fingers thin but steady. "You didn't have to do what you did," she said at last. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air. Samuel poked the fire with a stick, watching sparks drift upward. "Didn't feel like much of a choice. That's not how most men think." He looked up at her. "Maybe most men haven't seen what I've seen." Her gaze held his for a moment, searching, before she turned toward the fire again. "They said things about me in town." "I heard," he replied. "I don't believe them." Mara gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're right not to. I never stole from the sheriff's wife. And I'm not a witch." "I figured as much," Samuel said. He reached for the coffee pot he'd set near the flames and poured her a tin cup. "But you've got enemies." She took the cup, warming her hands on the metal before sipping. "Not just enemies. Something worse. Sheriff Jeb works for men who don't want certain land in the hands of my people. My father wouldn't sell it. That's why I'm here, or was." Samuel leaned back, the firelight catching the hard lines of his face. "And now they'll come after you to finish the job." "And after you," she added, meeting his eyes again. He didn't argue. The truth was clear enough. He had stepped into something that wouldn't end with freeing her from that post. The night grew deeper, the sky above them a black bowl filled with sharp stars. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, the sound rising and falling in the dark. Samuel tossed another branch onto the fire, the flames licking higher for a moment before settling. "You know where you're headed?" he asked. "There's a place west of the Red Rock Bluffs," she said. "Safe ground at least for a while. But it's 3 days' ride and the trails aren't empty." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then we ride at first light." For a long while they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Mara's eyes kept scanning the darkness beyond the gully, and Samuel's hand rested loosely near the rifle lying beside his bedroll. The wind shifted once, carrying the faint scent of horses, not Coppa's and not close enough to hear. Samuel's jaw tightened. "They've already started looking," he said quietly. Mara's grip on her cup tightened, but she didn't speak. Samuel stood and walked to the edge of the gully, peering into the night. He could see nothing, but his instincts told him they had less time than they'd hoped. When he returned to the fire, he spoke in a low voice. "Get some rest if you can. We'll need to move fast tomorrow." Mara lay down near the warmth, her face turned toward the flames. Samuel stayed awake a while longer, staring into the dark until his eyes ached. Somewhere out there, riders were crossing the land, following the faint trace of dust they'd left behind. And in the quiet, Samuel understood, freeing her had been the easy part. Keeping her free would take everything he had. By the time the first light touched the horizon, Samuel knew they were being hunted. The wind was still, the air cool with the promise of heat to come. Somewhere out in the open country, a hawk's cry split the quiet. But beneath the normal sounds of the land, Samuel caught something else, the faint, rhythmic beat of multiple hooves moving in unison. He glanced at Mara. She was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the cold ashes of the fire. She didn't ask what he'd heard, the look in his eyes told her enough. "They'll ride hard," she said. "So will we." They mounted Copper, Samuel scanning the ridgelines for movement as they pushed westward. Every mile put more land between them and Dry Creek, but it also narrowed the gap between him and trouble. Back in town, the gossip had already curdled into something sharp. By midday after their departure, the saloon doors swung open every few minutes to admit another voice ready to speculate, accuse, or embellish. "Rancher's lost his mind," one man muttered over a beer. "Talking off with that chain girl? Makes him as guilty as she is." Another snorted. "Ain't about guilt. It's about making a fool of the sheriff. That's something Dry Creek won't forgive." The more they talked, the more the story shifted. By the time the sun set, Samuel had been painted as a man who'd kidnapped the girl, shot 2 deputies and stolen a month's worth of supplies. None of it true, but truth didn't hold much weight once a story caught fire. And Sheriff Jeb knew exactly how to fan those flames. Standing in front of the general store, he told the gathered crowd that Samuel Carver was dangerous, unstable, and armed, and that any man who spotted him had a duty to alert the law. He spoke of justice, of protecting the town's good name, but the hard glint in his eyes was about something else entirely. By evening, Jeb had a posse of 6 mounted men ready to ride. They carried rifles, shotguns, and the quiet confidence of men who believed they were in the right, or at least in the stronger position. 2 days later, Samuel and Mara reached the edge of the dry flats. It was the kind of land where a man could be seen for miles, with nowhere to hide but behind the low rise of a dune. That's when Samuel spotted the dust cloud. Small at first, then growing. "Riders. They've found us," he said. Mara twisted in the saddle, her face pale but set. "We can't outrun them forever." "No. But we can buy some time." Samuel guided Copper toward a jagged outcrop of rock that jutted from the earth like the spine of some ancient beast. They dismounted in the shadow of the stone, and Samuel quickly scanned the land. To the north, a narrow pass cut between 2 rises, a natural choke point. "They'll come through there," he muttered. "Gives us one way in, one way out." Mara frowned. "And if they get through? Then we keep moving no matter what." That night they made camp without a fire. The stars were bright above them, but Samuel barely looked up. His mind was back at the ranch, his cattle left in the pastures, the old barn leaning slightly from years of wind. He'd left it in peace, thinking he'd return to the same quiet life. But now he pictured Sheriff Jeb's men riding in, kicking open doors, turning over feed bins, maybe even torching the place to send a message. Mara seemed to read his thoughts. "If they can't catch us, they'll go after what's yours." "Yeah," Samuel said quietly. "Would you go back for it?" He shook his head after a moment. "A ranch can be rebuilt. A man can't." Her expression softened, but she didn't push the matter. Near dawn, Samuel heard the first distant clatter of hooves again. This time closer. He checked his rifle, loaded the chambers, and handed Mara a small revolver. "Only if you have to," he told her. By mid-morning, the posse was in sight, dark silhouettes against the shimmering heat of the flats. They weren't rushing now. They knew they had their quarry pinned between open land and the pass. Samuel waited until they were within shouting distance. "Turn back," he called. His voice carried across the dry air. Sheriff Jeb's answer came cold and clear. "Hand her over, Carver, and we might just let you ride away." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You and I both know that's a lie." Jeb smiled faintly, a man used to holding all the cards. "Then you're making this harder than it needs to be." Samuel raised his rifle just enough to make his meaning plain. "So are you." For a moment, the desert held its breath. Then Jeb lifted his hand, and the riders fanned out. The first shots cracked the stillness, the sharp echo bouncing off the rock walls of the pass. Dust kicked up around Samuel's boots as he returned fire, the rifle's recoil slamming into his shoulder. Mara stayed low behind the stone, her eyes darting between Samuel and the riders closing in. It wasn't a long fight, just long enough to slow the posse's advance. Samuel knew when the odds were against him, and this was one of those times. "Go," he barked, grabbing Coppa's reins. Mara swung up onto the saddle without argument, and Samuel mounted behind her. The moment the last shot rang out, they spurred Copper through the narrow pass, the sound of pounding hooves following like a drumbeat. Behind them, Jeb reined in his horse at the mouth of the pass, frustration etched deep into his face. "They'll head west," one of his men said. Jeb's eyes narrowed. "Then west it is. And when we catch them, we'll make sure he regrets ever stepping foot in my town." The sun dipped low, turning the sky into a smear of crimson and gold. Samuel and Mara had been riding for hours since slipping through the pass, their shadows stretching long across the cracked earth. The land here was rougher, twisted junipers, red boulders stacked like forgotten monuments, and gullies deep enough to swallow a horse whole. Kappa's pace had slowed to a steady trot, foam streaking his neck. Samuel could feel the gelding's exhaustion in every step. Mara hadn't spoken in some time, her gaze fixed ahead as if willing the horizon to offer safety. They crested a rise, and the world opened into a canyon of sheer red walls. Wind funneled through the gap, carrying the faint scent of rain, rare, almost mythical in these parts. Samuel pulled Copper to a halt, scanning the terrain. "This place," Mara murmured. "I've seen it before." He turned to her. "When?" Her eyes darted away. "In dreams? Or maybe, in warnings." Samuel studied her for a moment, unsure what to make of it. He'd learned not to dismiss the things she said. Some part of him knew they carried weight. They found a narrow shelf of rock where Copper could rest, sheltered from view. As night crept in, Samuel gathered what little dry brush he could for a small fire. The flames painted the canyon walls in flickering amber, throwing long, wavering shadows. "You've been quiet," Samuel said, handing Mara a strip of jerky. "There's something you don't know," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "Back in town? I wasn't just chained for stealing. I was chained because I refused to go with them." "Them?" She hesitated. "The ones who paid the sheriff." Samuel's jaw tightened. "And who are they?" Mara shook her head slowly. "Not from the town. Not from this county. Men who ride under a black sun on their flag. They've been hunting my people for years." Samuel stared into the fire, the words sinking deep. He'd thought this was about one crooked lawman and his bruised pride. Now it sounded like something much bigger, and much worse. Somewhere in the canyon, a rock clattered. Both of them froze. Samuel's hand went to his rifle. The sound came again, closer this time. A low, deliberate scrape like boot leather against stone. "We're not alone," Mara whispered. Samuel put out the fire with a swift kick of sand, plunging them into darkness. The moon was just rising, silvering the edges of the cliffs. He motioned for Mara to stay low. A shadow moved along the ridge above them, too tall and broad to be a stray animal. Then another. And another. Samuel's gut tightened. These men didn't move like Jeb's posse. They were quieter, their silhouettes marked by long coats and wide-brimmed hats. A voice called down, calm and cold, "Carver, we've been expecting you." Mara's breath caught. "It's them?" The men began to descend, boots crunching on loose rock. Samuel counted at least 5, maybe more in the shadows. "What do you want?" he called back, rifle raised. "Not you," the voice answered. "Her." Mara's hand found his arm, fingers trembling but grip firm. "If they take me, you won't see me again." "Then they're not taking you," Samuel said flatly. A faint chuckle came from the leader. "You've got grit, rancher. Shame you rode into a game that's bigger than you can play." The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of something acrid, oil, gunpowder, maybe even blood. Samuel knew this was about to break bad. He stepped in front of Mara, setting his stance. Last chance to walk away. The leader tilted his head as if amused. "You don't get to make the rules out here." Without warning, a flare of light exploded from the canyon floor to their left, a signal. In the sudden brightness, Samuel saw more shapes moving in, surrounding them. Copper snorted nervously, stomping at the rocky ground. "Mara," Samuel said quietly, "when I tell you, you run." Her voice shook. "And you?" "I'll catch up." The first shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Samuel returned fire, forcing 2 of the strangers to duck behind boulders. But there were too many angles, too many dark corners. Mara broke into a sprint toward a narrow gap in the rock, just as Samuel had planned. But before she reached it, a figure stepped into her path, tall, faceless in the moonlight, a rope in hand. "Mara." Samuel's shout was lost in the chaos of gunfire. The stranger lunged. Mara twisted away, the rope missing her by inches. She vanished into the gap, her footsteps pounding on stone. Samuel tried to follow, But another man dropped from the ridge in front of him, swinging the butt of a rifle. The blow caught Samuel hard in the temple and the world blurred. Through the haze he heard the leader's voice again, distant but clear. "Find her. Kill him." Samuel collapsed to one knee, fighting to stay conscious. The last thing he saw was the shadow of the black sun emblem fluttering on a torn scrap of cloth. The sound of retreating hoofbeats echoed into the night.